We are so excited that everybody is here. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Let me thank my co-hosts first and foremost, Mayor Tom Tate of Anaheim, Jorge Lorza of Providence, who together, this is kind of a three-person show we've done for a couple years now, to welcome you on behalf of the Latino Alliance here at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And also, you'll hear from both of these gentlemen who have done such an extraordinary job leading our immigration platform and efforts at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And most of all, I want to thank each one of the mayors and the staff that's here for really showing that immigration and issues of importance to the Latino community, larger than just immigration, because we care about education and economic development and other things, that in your cities where there are large Latino populations and around the immigration work, that there really is this great bipartisan consensus on an agenda to move forward. We'll obviously be talking a lot about some of our defensive measures today, but I want to just say it's really important for all of us to stay proactive and to make sure that while we're doing what's right, doing what works, and doing what will help this nation move forward on immigration policy, that we not only point out the things that we think need to be fixed and need to be solved by Washington, but the ways that America and American cities in particular are innovating in that space. The hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of residents in America who qualify for citizenship today, but have not filled out, for instance, those citizenship forms. The ways that we can reach out in moments of insecurity to make sure that our streets are safe, to make sure that our small businesses are starting up, and to make sure that our families are kept whole as well. It's been a privilege to lead the Latino Alliance for the last 2 years, and I want to thank the conference for helping put that alliance together. I also want to thank as well Sharon Waxman, our great staffer who has helped put together a really exciting program as well. I think for the past year, a lot of our energies have been consumed by the whims and winds of Washington. We see ever-changing political moments, even yesterday, sometimes minutes before we come together to talk about our proactive agenda that seeks to maybe derail us. But I've been so impressed by this conference and North, South, East, West, Republican, Democratic, Independent, to really be able to continue marching forward. Federal government, sometimes we're seeing these days, is talking about deporting communities where we want to help build them up. And building community is really what this is all about here today. You know, we see in Congress a lot of discussions that happen sometimes without our people at the table, the people that we represent, or even the voices of their leaders that are here today. We know that we're best when nobody is left behind, when we listen to everybody's talents. And so since last year when we all stood together, passing pretty historic coming together of bipartisan mayors saying let's pass comprehensive immigration reform, something that still is the end goal, I think, for all three of us and all of us that signed on to that last year, we want to also be able to make sure we have a strong agenda to move forward with some of the tactical issues before us, from Dreamers, which we'll hear about today, to some of the work that we can do to continue to look at what we need to do in our communities, in our integration with ICE, in our integration with federal authorities, and the work that we need to say very loud and very clear because we have that knowledge on the ground. Share a quick story that some of you heard yesterday during the press conference that we had, and then I'll pass it over to Mayor Tate to say some introductory remarks. But I think the worst phone call a mayor can get is hearing that a police officer has been shot in your city. And I got that call in December. It was a Korean immigrant who had come to America to study, and she dreamed of being a Los Angeles police officer. Her graduation last year, she was on the job for less than a year when a normal traffic stop, pedestrian traffic stop, she and her partner were fired on by somebody down the street who saw two people wearing a badge and decided to try to kill them. 9 shots later, 8 of them didn't hit anybody miraculously, but 1 of them hit her, and thankfully it was in her leg. She was rushed to the hospital, surgeons helped to save her, and she's back at home recovering after pretty intense trauma. But we were able to find that would-be assassin of a police officer because the work that we had done in our city to build trust between our law enforcement and the immigrant communities. Many of those folks they believed were probably undocumented who said he went that way. Within a half hour they found that shooter in a store, arrested him, and were able to charge him. This is something that should transcend our politics. At moments of need and trauma, or moments of aspiration and hope, we know just how important immigrants have been, and I'll just say on behalf of the Alliance, the fast-growing Latino population has been and continues to be in our city. So we really look forward to opening this up for you, owning the immigration agenda, the Latino agenda of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I want to thank you all for being here and toss it over to Tom Tate to say a few words as well.
Thank you, Mayor Garcetti. Thank you for your leadership on this issue for years. My name is Tom Tate. I'm mayor of Anaheim. Anaheim's a city of about 360,000 people. Maybe about 70,000 of the people in our city are undocumented. Thousands of those folks are dreamers. The reason this mayor's conference is passionate about this issue is that mayors deal firsthand. These dreamers are our neighbors. They're our friends. We know them. They all share the American dream. So, as mayors, we've come together in a bipartisan way, and so this issue needs to be solved. It needs to be solved by Congress. We've been seeking comprehensive immigration reform for the past 5 years, but this one's critical. There's a deadline. And maybe I'm optimistic, or maybe that's why I'm optimistic, is because there is a deadline. Sometimes it takes a deadline in Congress where things actually get done. So hopefully we're close. I'm a Republican. My co-chair, Jorge Elorza, Mayor Elorza from Providence, is a Democrat. He is from the East Coast. I'm from the West Coast. The symbolism is on purpose. It's really just about every mayor in this conference agrees with us for the need for reform on this issue. Last fall, we had a bipartisan day of action calling for passage of the DREAM Act, in which a bipartisan group of mayors met with members of Congress. We have held several days of action. We've sent bipartisan mayor letters to Congress, but passage of the DREAM Act still eludes us. We know that there are currently bipartisan efforts underway in Congress to resolve the untenable situation in which DACA recipients and their families find themselves. We must do everything we can to get Congress and the President to accept these bipartisan efforts and pass the DREAM Act. We are fortunate to have with us today two people who help us to do that. We'll first hear from Avida Musavan, who will provide us an update on where the DREAM Act stands right now. Avida is a senior policy attorney with the National Immigration Law Center, an organization which has provided us with invaluable advice and assistance over the last few years. We'll then hear from Tony Choi, a dreamer who came to this country at the age of 9 from Korea, overcame many hurdles, earned a college degree, is now working in New York City and advocating on behalf of dreamers and for passage of the DREAM Act. He will tell us what the impact of uncertain legal status and fear of deportation has been on him and his family. Now, Vida, the floor is yours.
Okay. Mayor Elorza made one quick suggestion. I'd ask mayors not to say anything but their name and where they're from, but mayors just introduce each other. I know we all have opinions on this, and we'll get to discussion, but just so everybody knows who's present, and then we'll do that.
Bill Carpenter, Brockton, Massachusetts. Christopher Cabalden, West Sacramento, California.
Kevin Richardson, Lake Barrington, Illinois.
Tony Martin.
Chris Watts, Denton, Texas.
Lisa Gilmore, Santa Clara, California.
Michael Vargas, Paris, California.
Ted Winter, Santa Monica, California. Surrounded by the great city of Los Angeles.
Kevin Buckley, Annapolis, Maryland. It's a long swim from Australia. So, and now I'm the mayor. Thank you.
Megan Barry, the mayor of Nashville, Tennessee.
Richard O'Brien, Riverbank, California.
Elia Garcia from the city of Socorro, Texas.
John Yang, not a mayor, but executive director of an Asian American civil rights organization.
Steve Schul, Durham, North Carolina.
Kent Gwynn, Mayor of Ocala, Florida.
David Terrasas, Santa Cruz, California.
Steve Jones, Mayor of Garden Grove, next door to Mayor Tom Tate's beautiful city of Anaheim.
James Theosa, Central Falls, Rhode Island.
Colleen Cutter, San Leandro, California. Carol Dutra-Vernacci, Union City, California.
John Bowders, Emeryville, California.
Karen Freeman Wilson, Gary, Indiana.
Jorge Elorza, Providence, Rhode Island.
Ethan Berkowitz, Anchorage, Alaska.
Shane Bemis, Gresham, Oregon, trustee for the U.S. Conference of Mayors.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Sly James, Kansas City, Missouri.
Thank you.
Bobby Hopewell, Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the organizers of this important event. I'm very grateful to have all of you here in Washington, D.C. at a very timely moment in the struggle to protect those with DACA and to protect all dreamers. As was said before, I'm Abida Mousavian. I'm a senior policy attorney with the National Immigration Law Center. For those of you who may not know our work, we are an organization that has been around for over 35 years. We're based in Los Angeles, but have an office here in Washington, D.C., and we are exclusively dedicated to advancing the rights and opportunities of low-income immigrants. The issue of access to status generally for all of the 11+ million people who are here, the parents of dreamers who have their own dreams and are dreamers themselves, are extremely important to us, and making sure that they are embedded into the fabric of our society through the recognition of granting them status as well as other rights and opportunities is really critical to our mission. I want to provide just a little bit of context for how we got to the place that we're in today. As many of you know, during the 2015 and 2016 campaign period, candidate Trump very much campaigned on a platform, promised to, among other things, both build a wall and also to terminate the DACA program. As that happened, we entered the third, fourth, and then fifth year of the DACA program's existence. It has been in place since June of 2012, and in that time, we have seen nothing but just the unflagging successes of the program and what it has meant to transform the lives of the people, the 800,000 people who have been granted DACA, and the many more who looked forward to aging into the program. For the first several months of the administration, it was sort of left in an uncertain state. On September 5th, that uncertainty ended, and unfortunately, in what was in our view, an arbitrary, swift, and cruel manner, the entirety of the program was terminated. And I want to be clear because I know it can be confusing to understand the contours of the program and what exactly happened on September 5th. But at that time, and since then, 122 people have been losing DACA every day. So some of you may have heard this idea that there's a March 5th deadline. That was only a temporary basically an end point. So for folks whose DACA was expiring between September 5th and March 5th, they would have an opportunity, if they had already applied for and received DACA, to renew it. But what it meant for the many hundreds of thousands of people whose status expired after March 5th, that they would not have an opportunity to renew. So I think of it in terms of triaging terms. We are dealing with a very suffering and very someone who's very much in need of assistance. And instead, what we will see starting March 5th is really a hemorrhaging of the pain that is being inflicted on communities. So it's already present. It's already very much created a destabilizing effect for the many people who have DACA, and also we can't isolate communities. We know that folks with DACA are our siblings, our colleagues, our parents, our teachers, our healthcare providers, our neighbors, and so the idea that there's somehow some way to restrict or isolate the harm, unfortunately, is not at all the case. It actually has a very pronounced ripple effect on entire communities, as all of you know quite well. Since September 5th, there has been an active push to urge Congress to act now, not to wait till March 5th, not to wait to any other date, but really to pass legislation. This is also not a new concept. Some version of a DREAM Act has been introduced in Congress for over 16 years now, and we have been fighting this fight with many of you for many years. It is something that has only increased in bipartisan support in that 16 plus years. Recent polls show 87% of Americans from very diverse parts of the country want to see a permanent solution to make sure that people with DACA have a pathway to status and a way to remain in our communities. Unfortunately, we obviously have had a lot of challenges on the congressional front. There has been an effort in this Congress probably no surprise, it's very difficult to move things on their own. And so much of the fight has revolved around the budget process. Democrats who are in the minority have used this as an opportunity to try to insist on the inclusion of some kind of DACA legislation. There has been now bipartisan efforts where there's been a lot of support both in the House and in the Senate. Some of you may be familiar that in the last couple of weeks, there's a House bill that currently has around 50 co-sponsors, half of whom are Republican, half of whom are Democrat, that would ensure a permanent fix to DACA and to allow for a path to citizenship. It also includes border provisions. Speaking on behalf of my organization, there's obviously things that we would like to see different in that legislation. However, we recognize the importance of that kind of bipartisanship and reasonableness in trying to move the conversation forward. It's been very difficult with the back and forth in negotiations and real uncertainty around how the decisions are being made and who's making the decisions on behalf of the White House. As many of you know, not just with respect to DACA, but with respect to other populations at risk of losing their protections or who have already lost their protections, including hundreds and thousands of Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, people from Haiti, and soon the fates of Syrians with temporary protected status is also under consideration. So there's a real fear around sort of how not just decisions around DACA are being made, but also other programs at risk. Currently, there is, at the moment, until February 8th, a temporary continuing resolution on our budget that's in place. As you may have seen in the last 15 hours or so in the news cycle, there's once again, very different signals coming from the White House in terms of what they are willing to consider with respect to any DREAM package. What has been made clear is that they are going to separate the pursuit of finalizing the budget and then also separately dealing with DACA. I think it's extremely challenging to have a president who has a base that looks to him for an anti-immigrant agenda, while also having a president who I think would like to be viewed favorably and has made statements that suggest that he wants to be viewed favorably by the Dreamer population. And I think those two things are inherently in conflict, which has made it incredibly challenging to rely on the statements from the White House as indicators of what may happen. What is clear and what will remain true and consistent, regardless of the position of the White House between now and March 5th, and certainly only more starkly clear after March 5th, is that the pain and suffering that is happening in communities, in all of your communities, will only become more pronounced. And I think what I would say to all of you is, as much as there is room to really push policies at the local level and the state level to advance protections, whether it's in the form of access to driver's licenses and higher education and all the kinds of things that really help ensure that people are embedded and protected in their communities as much as possible, even in the absence of reforms in our federal immigration laws, is I think that you all play a really crucial role in uplifting the challenges and the harms that you will see only in more increased ways in the coming weeks, and certainly after March 5th, if we don't have a congressional resolution to this problem. On a parallel track, I just want to briefly mention that we are also fighting for Dreamers in the courts. There are currently a number of cases that have been consolidated in California, and there was a nationwide temporary injunction that was issued that allowed for not new DACA applications, but for anybody who had previously applied, they may renew. On January 13th, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services issued guidance on what that process would look like. I think it's fair to say that there are large questions looming around how those applications will be processed, if the same deference to prior applications and the discretion that was used in prior applications will be applied by this administration again, what the timing will look like for processing those applications. This is an administration that has made it very clear that they want to quickly appeal this and have the Supreme Court take this up. So the idea that the same agency that's fighting to maintain termination of the program will also be favorable to processing renewal applications is a little bit hard to reconcile. At the same time, there's also a court that we are co-counsel in New York, and that's advancing as well. There's an upcoming hearing on Tuesday to argue for also another nationwide injunction that would actually be broader in scope and not just allow for renewal applications to go forward, but new first-time applicants as well. It's, I think, been made clear by the judges presiding in these proceedings that they feel that this is something that Congress should address. That being said, I mean, I think this really reflects that there are multiple strategies that we can engage in collectively to help fight to protect Dreamers, even though ultimately the final and really permanent solution does lie with Congress. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Aveda. Tony Choi, a Dreamer. Tony, please tell us your story.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the United States Conference of Mayors for extending this invitation. I would also like to show my appreciation to Mayor Lander and the conference for showing strong leadership in standing up for welcoming cities that we are proud to call home. My name is Tony Choi, and I am 29 years old. As of today, I have 315 days remaining on my deferred action for childhood arrivals. This means that after 315 days, I will lose protections that guard me from being detained and returning to a home country that I had not seen in 20 years. While I may have the privilege of having a ticking time bomb above my head for the next 300 days, so many of my peers inch closer and closer to deportation and falling out of their protections every single day, with some already falling out of status. Despite many who try to derail the argument, like Senator John Cornyn, saying that there is no emergency until March 5th, approximately 122 DACA recipients are losing DACA every single day. This is what will really happen on March 5th. The number will skyrocket to more than 1,000 a day. Every day, that represents thousands of employers who will have to let go of their qualified employees. That represents students without teachers, patients without healthcare workers, and community members who depend on each other to survive and thrive. But more importantly, these are thousands of lives that are being shattered. These are thousands of families that are being broken up and ripped apart for no justifiable reason. This is already happening because of congressional inaction, as we witnessed last weekend. With every day that goes by, the prospect for us, DACA recipients, the Dreamers, grows dimmer. Ever since President Trump's arbitrary end to DACA on September 5th, we have all gotten our elected officials from both sides on the aisle promises. And all we had gotten were promises, and this is in spite of 80% of Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, want a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients. This is also in spite of the fact that the Republican Attorney General of Tennessee, Herbert Slattery, who had been one of the litigants suing the Trump administration to terminate DACA, had withdrawn from the case and called upon Senators Corker and Alexander to find a solution. Recently, I had the pleasure of meeting Senator Lindsey Graham, who had been spearheading this exact effort. Senator Graham was adamant in the fact that he wanted a fundamental overhaul of our immigration system to make significant changes to family-based immigration. In recent days, family-based immigration had been denigrated as chain migration by the White House and the anti-immigrant voices. And Republicans want to use this opportunity to fundamentally change our immigration system to a quote-unquote merit-based system. This is a terrible idea. Over 80% of Asian Americans depend on family-based petitions. Family-based immigration built America as it is today. Even if we're purposefully trying to attract more high-skilled workers, they lose the incentive to come here without their families. Many of the immigrant entrepreneurs that we see in the Silicon Valley were results of family-based immigration. And as I've heard from Representative Jayapal, a merit-based system is a sex-exclusionary one, as it would slam the doors for many women seeking to join their families. I want to end this with one story of one immigrant family, and that's mine. My name is Tony Choi, and I am the proud son of Ki Jung Kim, a breast cancer and a domestic violence survivor, and a proud U.S. citizen as of last April. I am the son of a woman who refused to testify her abuser in court because she feared that my future in America would be placed in jeopardy. I am the son of a woman whose citizenship came at the price of her health and her justice. I am in Washington, D.C. today, last week, 2 weeks ago, fighting not only for her dreams, but for thousands of other immigrant families and mothers upon whose backs our dreams started from. We, the Dreamers, are the living embodiment of their hopes, dreams, and justice, just as many of you represent the legacies and dreams of your ancestors. So stand with us today and let us pass the DREAM Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So there's the argument. There's the argument.
There it is.
So now let me turn over to Mayor Elorza, Providence, Rhode Island, to talk about the federal and state challenges.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Tate. I want to begin by recognizing both Mayor Tate and Mayor Garcetti. Thank you for your leadership on this. It's been great to work with you over the past couple of years as part of this joint committee and conversation. I also want to recognize two people who are in the room today very quickly. We have Mickey Ibarra, who has been running the Tribute to Mayors for many years. The dinner today is at 6:30 at the Mayflower Hotel. Everyone is invited. Please join us. And you know anyone who's getting recognized later? Yeah, I think Mayor Garcetti might be receiving a nice recognition today. So please come out and support. I also want to recognize Jonathan Hasselk. He's here from Year Up. It's a workforce development organization. They do amazing work throughout the United States, and they've really leaned into this Dreamer and DACA issue. They work directly with Dreamers. They've mobilized the corporate community. They've been amplifying the voices of Dreamers and have done amazing work. And Jonathan has mentioned that if anyone is interested in the work that they do and how they might do some of this work in your cities, please talk to Jonathan. Reflecting back on yesterday, I think that, at least for me personally, one of the most sort of satisfying experiences that I've had as mayor is being among other mayors. And yesterday, literally standing shoulder to shoulder and standing together, it was a really powerful show. And in particular, what I believe is so powerful about being amongst mayors and learning from mayors is that we have little interest in winning an argument, right? Our interest is in solving problems. And as mayors, we're not driven by ideology. We're driven by evidence. And so we're here to continue telling the federal government that if they're truly interested in solving problems, then follow the evidence. We know that immigrants participate in the labor market at higher rates than natives. In 2010, we know that 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by either immigrants or their children. And so if we want to have a strong and healthy economy, we should have a welcoming policy towards immigrants. We also know that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than natives. And so if we're looking to ensure public safety throughout our country, we should have a welcoming policy towards immigrants. We also know, somewhat ironically, that in survey after survey, immigrants show that they believe that the American dream still exists, at higher rates than do natives. And so at a very sort of deeply ironic level, if we're looking to preserve those ideals that frankly give rise to our own sense of national identity, then we should have a welcoming policy towards immigrants. And we as mayors in our cities, we know this and we recognize it. And as a result of that, we've adopted a number of very thoughtful policies that we've implemented in our cities that have built those strong relationships with the immigrant community and has sought to fully integrate them into our cities. Unfortunately, many of these policies that we've implemented are under continuous attack from the federal government and oftentimes more and more by state governments. We've been told to do things that, frankly, we know are unconstitutional. We also know they're unproductive. And if we don't back off or backtrack, we risk losing federal enforcement funding dollars. Furthermore, some of us have been called out very directly and very particularly by officials at the highest level of government. Just yesterday, the Attorney General sent letters to 23 jurisdictions demanding that they produce documents to show that they're complying with the law. Now, 23 jurisdictions were called out just yesterday, but as mayors, we know that when you threaten one mayor, you're threatening us all, because it's these 23 jurisdictions today but it could be any one of us around the table tomorrow. So it's an issue of which we are very deeply concerned. And here to brief us today on some of these federal and also state efforts challenging many of our community, citywide, and local efforts is Brian Hausman, who's a partner at Tabbitt, DeVito, and Rothstein in Chicago. Brian has been providing outstanding pro bono representation to the USCM in Chicago versus Sessions, and he's here to give us an update on the state of litigation across the country and also in our communities. So I'll hand it off to Brian.
Thank you so much, Mayor Elorza. I want to thank the mayors, first of all, and the conference's leadership for trusting my partners and I to represent them in federal court in Chicago. One of my partners, Kate O'Brien, is with me here today. We've had the honor of representing you, and we thank you so much for allowing us to say a few words today about the litigation and about what we see as issues going forward. Thank you also to my fellow panelists for letting me sit next to you, and Tony for sharing your story. I'm a firm believer that courts in particular and policymakers of all sorts often get it very wrong when they lose track of the actual impact that their decisions may have on people in their communities. And so Tony sharing his story today is important for us. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Garcetti.
I'll make sure they can hear you back there, too.
Specifically, the issue in Chicago versus Sessions is whether the Attorney General can condition the receipt of Burn JAG funding, federal law enforcement grant funding, on several immigration enforcement-related conditions. I'll talk about them in a moment. But significantly, as Mayors Garcetti and Elorza articulated a moment ago, the stakes for cities here are very high. Cities such as Chicago have had welcoming city policies in place for decades. And Chicago Mayor Harold Washington enacted the first such iteration of that policy in 1980, or early 80s. And they've had those policies in place in large part because the evidence, as Mayor Elorza would tell you, suggests that those policies make their communities safer. They do not, as some would have us believe, particularly lately, they do not call for the harboring of criminal aliens. They call for the appropriate enforcement of local laws in a way that does not alienate communities that are absolutely essential to the enforcement of those laws. And the evidence, I think, is that so-called sanctuary jurisdictions are safer because of it. The case in Chicago has implications not just for the Burn JAG grant program, but for other grant programs. And of course, it has implications for cities across the country as well. It has its genesis, as Evita touched on a moment ago, I think, really in President Trump's executive order last January, in which he purported to give the Attorney General sweeping authority to withhold any federal funding of any kind to sanctuary jurisdictions of his choosing. The term's never been defined for me, and that was part of the problem with the order. That order was enjoined in the Northern District of California, first preliminarily and then permanently, and is now on appeal to the Ninth Circuit. But what that caused from a political perspective and ultimately led to the Chicago case was kind of a fallback. The Attorney General then, rather than being granted kind of across-the-board authority to withhold funds, then started choosing particular statutes that he could withhold funds in exchange for conditions. And so what are those conditions? There are three that are at issue in the Chicago case and other cases that have popped up across the country. And they are, first, notice that cities like Chicago provide federal law immigration enforcement officers with advance notice of the release date and time of any alien in their custody. Second, the access condition, that any city or jurisdiction that has a lockup or a jail of any kind provide access to federal authorities to conduct custodial interrogations of aliens or suspected non-citizens in their jurisdiction. And then finally, something that made the news yesterday, as Mayor Lorja mentioned, 8 U.S.C. 1373, which is a statute that's been on the books for some time, and it merely provides that localities cannot prohibit their law enforcement officials or other agents from sharing citizenship and immigration status information with federal authorities. For the first time in 2016, there was some version of a condition in the Berne-JAG applications that required some compliance with that statute. Cities like Chicago were happy to report that they complied with the statute on the grounds that they do not prohibit the sharing of such information. They also don't make it a point to collect such information, but they certainly are not in violation of the statute, and that's been their position throughout. The litigation...
Brian, just a quick point of clarification on that. So Section 1373, to the best of your knowledge, are there any cities in the United States that don't comply with Section 1373?
I haven't studied every ordinance, but I'm not aware of any city that does not comply. I'm also not aware of any city that has not certified compliance or been willing to certify its compliance with Section 1373 as written. And I say that because, the Attorney General, following, some of the Chicago litigation in large part, the Attorney General has begun to reinterpret Section 1373. And I want to kind of tell you how we got there as well. In August, Chicago filed suit. They challenged all 3 of the conditions on the Berne-JAG program, both constitutionally, and they argued that by statute, the Attorney General was not authorized to impose those conditions. Last September, a judge in the Northern District of Illinois issued a preliminary nationwide injunction against the first 2, the notice condition and the access condition. The court ruled that the Attorney General lacked authority under the Berne-JAG statute by Congress to impose such conditions on the receipt of the funds. He declined at this time to rule that the Attorney General was not allowed to require a certification of compliance with Section 1373. That was an issue those 2 issues are now up on appeal in the Seventh Circuit. The case was argued last Friday, and I would expect a decision within weeks, but it's hard to say. The injunction that was issued in the Northern District was nationwide in scope. And so on appeal, the Attorney General has brought 2 challenges. The first is to the ruling that he lacks statutory authority to impose the conditions in the first place. The second is to the issue of whether or not Chicago is able to pursue a nationwide injunction that protects all of you in this room and other cities who are Berne-JAG recipients. Both of those issues have been argued in the Seventh Circuit, and in large part, that second issue has caused the conference to play a very major role in the Chicago litigation. Following the grant of the preliminary injunction, the Attorney General moved to stay that injunction, first in the District Court and then in the Seventh Circuit. And for the first time in the stay motion, the Attorney General argued not just that the court should not grant a nationwide injunction, but that the court actually lacked the authority under Article 3 to do it, because Chicago was Chicago and it didn't need a nationwide injunction, according to the Attorney General, in order to satisfy itself. The conference was asked by Chicago at that time to intervene as a co-plaintiff in the case, to kind of give the lie to the notion that there are not other communities out there relying on this injunction. And we did move to intervene. The court, in a very careful ruling, held that intervention essentially is premature, but reaffirmed that all of these cities are relying on this, on the injunction, and reaffirmed that the conference, if it so chooses in the future, has the ability to represent its members in that way in litigation, which I think was a significant ruling for the conference. So then next steps, where do we go from here? In Chicago, our case has been accepted, is under review by the Seventh Circuit. Depending on how the Seventh Circuit rules, it may very well go to the Supreme Court. And there are, of course, other jurisdictions who have filed very similar lawsuits. Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles is involved in litigation with regards to the COPS program, a very similar issue there. In addition to that, the Attorney General, I said earlier, kind of fell back to placing conditions on specific grants. Now that 2 of those 3 conditions have been enjoined, the notice and access conditions, he has begun to reinterpret Section 1373 to require, at a minimum, notice of the release dates and times of aliens in custody, which does not, in my view, fall within the definition of immigration status or citizenship information that's really governed by 1373. And even to perhaps signal that he will take it a little bit further than that. And that has led to, I think, kind of 3 ways in which I think we're going to see further litigation from cities on 1373. The first is that the administration has continued to delay not just the release of almost $300 million in allocated funds to cities and states, but has delayed what he has claimed to be a final ruling. And just yesterday asked for further information that, as Mayor Garcetti said, I think everybody has provided or is certainly willing to provide and could have provided many months ago had it been requested. So I think that's an effort to further delay, both for the litigation and perhaps for other measures. And so I think that those issues surrounding 1373 are not going to go away regardless of how the Seventh Circuit rules on the first 2 conditions. They're going to continue to be litigated.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. And I know there are questions, but we'll keep the questions to the very end, and Brian will be available to answer any questions after the session as well. We're going to hear from 2 mayors who have adopted policies and are engaged in litigation now because of state preemptive measures that they are dealing with in their cities and states. And first, we'll hear from the mayor of Gary, Indiana, Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Chairman Garcetti and to Mayor Lorza and Mayor Tate for the opportunity to share our experience with you. You know, Gary, Indiana is not a city that has a large immigrant population, but we are, like so many of you around this table, a city that was built by immigrants. And so in May of 2017, we took it upon ourselves to pass a welcoming city ordinance. And the ordinance was very specific in a number of aspects, but it specifically said, and this is something that members of the conference actually said to Attorney General Sessions, that we are not going to expend our precious resources ensuring that our local police serve as ICE agents. And we also indicated that we, however, understand, and nothing in the ordinance prevents or explicitly states that we will not comply with 8 U.S.C. Section 1373. We understand that. And we went about the business of implementing that ordinance and doing the people's business in the city of Gary. Well, the state of Indiana issued a state statute that went further, quite frankly, than Section 1373. And they have now indicated that any city in the state of Indiana that fails to actively cooperate and in any way restricts that cooperation with the federal government in its immigration or essentially in its deportation policies, then that city is found to be in violation of the state statute. And so in November of last year, we were sued by a group of citizens, ironically, one of whom was our former municipal judge. And we were sued by a gentleman by the name, well, that's using that term loosely, by a person by the name of James Bopp, who you may recognize as one who initiated the Citizens United litigation some years ago. So he came all the way to the small state of Indiana, to the little city of Gary, and found this ordinance and decided that he would try to further his agenda on our backs. But we are fighting that litigation. We are doing it in partnership and with the help of a public policy group from Georgetown University. And what we understand, and Brian underscored this as he talked about the posture of the Justice Department, they are withholding the distribution of JAG funds for everybody, not just those who have welcoming ordinances, not just those who describe themselves as sanctuary cities, but they have gone after every jurisdiction that receives JAG funding and withheld those dollars. And so to the extent that we can play a small role in saying that we believe that it is in the best interest, not just of the city of Gary, but the state of Indiana and the United States, to welcome all people and to be a welcoming city, then we stand by that and will certainly defend this litigation with all vigor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Freeman Wilson. Now we'll hear about some great work being done in Austin, and I'll pass it off to Mayor Steve Adler.
Good afternoon. I want to join in asking Mayor Garcetti and Elorza and Tate for your leadership on this issue. Over the course of the last year, I will tell you that as our state and our city has been embroiled in this issue, knowing that there were a union of mayors across the country actively engaged, as you have kept mayors engaged over the last year and unified and meeting and speaking for all of us has been a source of strength to my community. To know that when we stood up and said something, we were only saying what other mayors in other cities were saying around the country. It's impacted the run of the stories and the media attention because it changes the context. This is not Austin being weird, out by ourselves, but being part of what I think is a very mainstream movement and effort on behalf of mayors. You know, this whole discussion about immigration began in our state, as it did at the federal level, with the effort to demonize a certain group of people by suggesting that immigrants were more inclined to be lawbreakers than other people, disregarding the fact that the incidence of crime among immigrant populations is lower than the general population, that the incidence of crime among undocumented immigrant populations is lower than the incidence of crime in the general population, without regard to the thought that if we really wanted to lower crime rates around the country, obviously then we should bring in a lot more immigrants so that we can average down incidence of crime. But it also began with demonizing cities as targets and suggesting that there were cities all over the country that were breaking federal law in an effort to harbor bad people. Neither of those things are true, but that's how the discussion began. And I will tell you that I had people in my city and in my state wanting to know why it was that Austin thought it could violate and break federal law, especially for the purpose of protecting people that would be inclined to commit crimes. And the discussion that we had through the first part of last year was over the question of whether or not we were violating federal law. And you three led several trips to Washington, D.C. We met with the Attorney General and Homeland Security Director and came away knowing that we were not, in fact, violating federal law. We were not violating 1373. We were not violating anything by complying with what was required and making individualized decisions about whether we would agree to do the actions which were not required of cities but rather were discretionary. Once it became apparent that we weren't violating any federal laws, the Texas legislature decided to create a law that we could violate. And I think that it reads pretty much, kind of like the law in Indiana that seeks to make mandatory the requirements under federal law that are discretionary now, to require cities to comply with detainers in ways that were not required under federal law, and to require local law enforcement to spend its resources assisting in federal immigration in ways that are not required under federal law. You've already gone through the reasons why that's bad policy. It makes our city less safe because it impacts the trust relationship between our community and our police. And quite frankly, our city doesn't have the resources for our local law enforcement people to be federal immigration agents any more than federal gaming agents or federal tax agents or federal park agents or federal anything agents. They have a job to do in keeping our city safe. But our law was passed. The governor signed the law with a Facebook Live session late one Sunday, and then on Monday morning there was a preemptive lawsuit filed against Austin in federal district court. Of course, the law as signed didn't go into effect for another 2 months, so it was really hard to make the claim that we were violating a law that was not in force, but it was a kind of a preemptive strategy. Austin responded to that lawsuit by pointing out that we couldn't be violating something that wasn't in effect. We had, and then we joined other cities in a federal court action that we brought, as you can, challenging a law which on its face is unconstitutional in the San Antonio Federal Court. We challenged that in part because it required cities to do things that we believe fundamentally violate constitutional guarantees. We challenged that law because we believe that state action is federally preempted by a congressional balancing of what should and should not be required of local entities. And we challenged it because it was impossibly vague. It's impossible to apply a law that's seeking to prevent local municipalities from interfering with or needing to support federal action to know what that means in any given situation. Does it take from our police chief any and all discretion on whether he sends his officers to investigate a murder or to do support on an ICE raid? I mean, we just don't know how that works. And importantly, in the Texas law, there's a section where the Attorney General and the Governor have the ability to remove me from office if I were to endorse a policy different than that expressed in our Senate Bill 4. Clearly, that can't be constitutional. I do, however, have a very supportive city. Everybody has offered to visit me in jail or to... So we filed our action in federal court, district court. The federal district judge in San Antonio supported the position taken by the cities and joined the enforcement of the action. It was appealed to the Fifth Circuit, which unfortunately dissolved part of the injunction, allowing part of the law to continue to be enforced. Maintaining the injunction on other parts of it now is back in the San Antonio district court. But at this point, because of the state law that expressly requires our cities to do things, we are complying with that express provision even as we challenge it, which is why our city avoided the honor, I guess, yesterday of being named with 23 of our colleague cities but know that we are fighting this battle as best we can from the trenches that exist in Texas.
So this was supposed to end at 12:45, but we want to have space for everybody to speak. So we're proposing to go another 10 minutes. I think the session starts. That gives us 5 minutes to walk 30 seconds over to the next session and take whatever breaks people need to. Feel free if you need to peel off, but we want to have space for all of you. Ryan will be here. Avi Day will be here. We thank Tony, and he'll be here if folks want to make contact or ask individual questions with them. We'd ask folks just to ask brief, concise questions or brief points, just to make sure we can try to get to a handful of mayors before we have to recess. But I want to really thank this entire panel for their courage, for their story, and for their forthrightness in putting forward these American values. Yes, sir.
What should we be looking for on February 8th in terms of a Senate bill, and assuming we can get a clean bill out of the Senate, what happens in the House?
You saved the easy questions for me. In the Senate, as I'm sure you're aware, Senators Durbin and Graham have been leading the bipartisan effort there. I think it's unclear. I think there's a lot more confidence about a pathway forward for something in the Senate. It's less clear in the House, and ultimately, the will of the Speaker is really, I think, going to be a very crucial part of that. So it's just hard to say. That will hasn't been there yet, but even for the Republican leadership that has, from our perspective, kicked the can down the road on an issue that shouldn't have been forestalled any longer. There's a recognition that March 5th is a distinct date and serves, while not a deadline in our view, that deadline has been in place really since the program was terminated. But even for Republican leadership, it's recognized that March 5th is a turning point, so that may change the dynamics. But I wish I had the crystal ball, but I think that I kind of joke that in this Congress and in this administration, a day can sort of, the density of activity is sort of like a dog year. So February 8th feels very far away, but I think that ultimately the will of the Speaker is really critical.
Mayor Berkowitz. We just press your button just so we can hear you. Thanks.
What legal actions can a municipality take that has significance in terms of an immigration context to add layers of protection to individuals?
Brian?
I mean, you mentioned things like driver's licenses and such, but what else?
In terms of DACA or the Dreamers, or in terms
of DACA, in terms of Dreamers, in terms of making sure that we're providing every possible legal protection to people who might otherwise be subject to federal immigration authority?
Yeah, in terms of DACA, I think I would defer to Avita because she could give you a much better answer.
But the tactical answer is there's a lot of mayors and cities that have lawsuits, whether it was against the so-called Muslim ban, whether it was for Dreamers, whether it's some of the work in the criminal justice area. And you can join those in terms of amicus briefs and be a part of that. You can also launch ones in creative new areas.
But I mean, those are done in a defensive posture where you're reliant on existing constitution and existing law. But I'm thinking if there's something proactive that creates a legal condition.
Sure. And first, I just want to thank everyone in this room who, on so many issues, especially now as we are on the one-year anniversary of the signing of so many of those executive orders, just the importance of your role in the amicus brief process and in statements and resolutions at the local level. I'd be happy to follow up with more specific resources, but as more and more localities and states are under assault, we have been very much engaged in creating model policies, whether it's for healthcare providers, K through 12 and higher education institutions, to have certain policies in place. They obviously don't override federal law, but they play a very important role, much in the same way that training people to know their rights and to know how to exercise them. This is sort of the institutional version of that in civil society spaces. And then in terms of policy, there's a lot that can be done in terms of limiting information sharing in state and local databases so that they can't be used for immigration and enforcement purposes, access to things like professional licenses, higher education, in-state tuition, driver's licenses. There's a very diverse and exciting portfolio of options that states and localities can engage in and push for, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that after.
Maybe in Boston, we can talk about presenting some of those things to work on it ahead of time, but have, again, getting back on a proactive agenda and wishing for some more positive outcomes in these legal areas. We can maybe present some of that in Boston at the meeting too, and have a few mayors speak about some of those ordinances they passed.
I mean, one thing I would like to bring up is concept of municipal IDs. This is something that New York City has done that's been pretty successful. You know, now parents can go pick up their children without the fear of, being arrested and being deported. You know, I think that's one of the key things. And another, key thing that, that I would like to see is, making sure that immigrant students have access to their records. I have, beyond this work, I have also provided a lot of DACA legal assistance to a lot of young immigrants. And one of the troubles that they had was accessing their school records. I mean, in New York City, certain high schools charge $5 for transcripts, which they essentially need if they want to send in their DACA applications. So I mean, think basic policies like that. Making sure that undocumented immigrants can access these things without fear would be a great assistance.
The city of Santa Cruz has joined those lawsuits, but we're also starting to fund access to legal services for families in our communities. Are there clearinghouses where you see where best practices, the materials that are provided to families or people that need informational resources are available that we could turn to?
Yes, there is a website called informedimmigrant.com that is intended to be sort of a consolidated one-stop resource shopping for different audiences, including policymakers and individuals as well, on a range of issues and in multiple languages. And certainly if there's something that's missing or a gap, I'd welcome that feedback because we're always trying to update it. And I just want to thank you also for providing those legal services because they're very crucial, and more localities are engaging in that kind of commitment to fund people, particularly as we're increasing the threat and the ability to detain people where they're just most vulnerable and fighting their cases and being able to stay here.
Yes, please. Will you just press your button so we can hear you? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, my name is Alan Simon. I'm mayor of the village of Spring Valley. We have about 10,000 people, and we have a immigration problem there. We have approached it and attempting to enlarge our approaching it on a more personalized basis. What we're looking to do, and we have partially funded it already, is to engage the services of immigration specialists from a legal aid society who will provide services free of charge for our immigrant population. We want to do that because we find that in the area of immigrants, some of the lawyer specialists have a very harsh feeling of getting the money in advance and maybe not providing the service. So we wanted to provide a universal service available to our citizens so they can get the protection that the law allows. When you spoke about education, we thought this would be the best way by providing representation free of charge as if they were sort of in a criminal area, although it's certainly not being a criminal being born someplace else. We thought that this would be a good idea, and we're pushing, and we have a great deal of support from our assembly people who are in the area who have the ability to fund these things. On a secondary basis, we were looking to get to know the immigrants in our area who have problems and get to know them on a personal basis. We were going to do fingerprint checks to determine their legality. The members of my board, one of which is here, has indicated that they would sit down with the immigrants and write personal letters to the immigration authorities indicating that the individual lives here for a certain amount of time, works here, has been steady in his job or employment, and has, in essence, 3 or 4 kids in the school system. They have done well in the school system, and they are seeking to immerse themselves in what we call the citizenry of America and of our area. And we were going to emphasize this on a personal basis, whether I, as mayor, or Mr. Francois, who is over here, who is on our board and one of our most active community-based individuals.
That's wonderful. If I could just ask you to close up, because we're going to try to get to one more person. And this is wonderful stuff. But is there anything else you'd like to add to that? Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you for sharing that. And it shows no matter what size your city is, there's resources. And thank you for what you're doing to prove that and to bring that. And if other folks would like to talk and follow up and hear what you're doing, I hope, Mayor, you'll be a resource. One last comment or question? Over here, yes.
Yeah, I had a question following up on the informedimmigrant.com site, just in terms of resources that could be shared with the conference generally. My city is 1 square mile. We're at the east span of the Bay Bridge in Emeryville. I have 12,000 residents and 50,000 employees during the daytime. Many of them are hotel workers, janitorial staff at malls and office buildings, and we've begun a proactive campaign about reaching out to the employers about what their rights are in terms of not cooperating with someone who's not carrying an active warrant. I'm just really concerned about the number of employees in the East Bay, especially with the Trump administration's conversations about targeting Northern California. Does this have like a handout we can give to employers about what they can and can't say and do?
You just reminded me to see if the website is updated to have to include that information. But on NILC's website, we have information that's specifically for employers. Some of it is targeted towards employers who have folks with DACA on their staff, and then some of it is more generally in response to this environment where there are employers who want to know what their obligations are, but also what kinds of rights that they can exercise. So similar to what I was saying about sort of schools and healthcare providers adopting what we call safe zone policies, it's similar to that, but for the work site. And I'd be happy to email that to you as well.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you to our C-SPAN viewers as well. We always love C-SPAN being here to get this out to all of America. And we want to thank everybody. Speak up and speak out is my last message. There are Tonys in every single community, people who are American except for the final step, and that we need to continue to stand up for, speak out for, and tell the stories of. We are mighty and strong inside this room and inside this conference, and I think that we really have one thing that none of folks on the other side have, an intimate knowledge of who these people are and the wisdom of what it actually means to have their contributions in our cities and in our towns every single day. And that is a cause that is well worth fighting for. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.